getting into our next big one is the connective tissues. And again, this one has a lot of different types, so you're going to want to pay attention because it's going to be a long one. You'll probably want to make some flashcards for this one too, just like you would want to for the epithelial one, because this one, there's a lot of different tissues, and you're going to have to be able to know them by sight. So what are we going to be doing with this particular group of tissues? We're going to distinguish and identify them versus in the three categories: proper, supportive, and fluid. And we're going to break those three categories of connective tissue down even further. And then we're going to talk about what they do. So let's talk about what all connective tissues have in common first, right? We'll go kind of generic and then we'll work our way into the specific. So one thing that all connective tissues have in common is that they have some sort of matrix composed of a ground substance. And so this is where we see a lot of extra components that are not made of cells. So lots of fibers, lots of other materials that are acellular that are going to be forming the kind of the world that the cells are living in, creating like a material that the cells are suspended in. This matrix can be fluid, it can be a gel-like or semi-solid, and it can be completely solid. We'll talk about the matrix for each one, or at least a handful of them as we go through these. And then the functions of the connective tissue is to provide support and connection, protection. It can help us move things, and it can even store energy away. So there's a very diverse set of functions that the connective tissues have, and it really depends on which connective tissue you're looking at in terms of what is the main function for it. So let's talk about how we classify these. We have three major categories of connective tissue, and then we're going to break down each of those even further. So let's take a look at each of these. We have connective tissue proper, which is going to be made of loose and dense connective tissue, and we'll talk about those. We have supportive connective tissue, so cartilage and bone. And then fluid connective tissue, blood and lymph. And again, we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty in each of these. So we'll go pretty far in. We'll talk about all the different types of loose and dense connective tissue. We'll talk about types of cartilage, types of bone, right? There's a lot of moving parts to this particular section. So, what are some of the cells that we see in connective tissue proper? We're going to start with connective tissue proper. So, a few different types of cells we see there. We see fibroblasts, right? Fibrocytes, adipocytes, mesenchymal cells, macrophage cells, and mast cells. And then we also see fibers as well, so collagen, elastin, and reticular fibers that will help give some acellular structure to our connective tissue proper. So let's take a look at our kind of generic one here. So we see in blue here reticular fibers, right? In this kind of beige color we see collagen. In the green we see elastin fibers. The adipocytes or fat cells are going to be in yellow. Our macrophage is shown here in this light blue. Here is our fibroblast. There's that faint nucleus you can see there, but you see it's not very circular, right? We have some branches going out there. And then our mesenchymal cell here in purple, again, very faint nucleus there. So, pretty wild looking tissue. The connective tissue propers are going to look a little bit odd, right? They may look they may be a little hard to distinguish looking at one to another. So let's talk about some of the different types of loose connective tissue. So we're continuing with connective tissue proper. We're going to focus on some of the different loose connective tissue types. We'll start with probably the easiest one to identify, and that is adipose tissue or fat tissue. So fat tissue has a high number of the adipocytes because the focus is on storing fat. It looks empty, right? If we look at the real deal here on the right, it almost looks empty, right? It almost looks like things are hollow. But that white space you see is actually filled with fat, right? That's all the lipids that are stored inside there. And you'll notice they're so full that the nucleus and the cytoplasm is actually pushed to the side in there. Like here's a nucleus just kind of squished up against the wall of our little adipocyte, right? So adipose tissue is probably one of the easiest loose connective tissues to identify simply because it looks almost empty. It's going to look like this, right? It's very unique compared to the rest. Whereas areolar tissue kind of looks like a mess. It looks like the original one we saw earlier with all the macrophages and mesenchymal cells and all the different fibers. To an untrained eye, it looks like a mess, right? There's all sorts of cells in all sorts of locations. Right here's a mast cell. We see some fibroblasts here in the smaller shapes. And then there's fibers running all over the place, right? So we see these deeper, these thicker collagen fibers and these thin elastic fibers running all over. So it's very chaotic. So if you're trying to remember areolar tissue, just remember it's kind of chaotic compared to the rest. It doesn't make as much sense in terms of a pattern or an organizing feature. It doesn't stand out as organized. It doesn't stand out as it just doesn't stand out as organized. It looks kind of like a mess, right, if we're honest. But reticular tissue is going to have those reticular fibers in detail, and so here we see, right, these deep colors, like this almost black, purple, and that's representing all those reticular fibers that have been stained. Sometimes they'll be deep purple, but other times they may also be stained in orange color, but you're looking for that deeper color, right, where you can see these. And we tend to see reticular tissue or reticular loose connective tissue in things like glands, right? So we'll see those in particular glands like the kidneys and whatnot. So those are all the loose ones, but now let's get into the dense connective tissues. So here we have regular versus irregular. So regular, you'll notice, right, we're very densely packed, right, that stands out, but all of these collagen fibers are running in the same direction, right, they're all running together. Even though they're not perfectly straight, the idea is they're running in the same direction, and we see the fibroblasts kind of squished between them. Down here in the irregular dense, though, we see densely packed pockets of these collagen fibers, but the direction they're running kind of goes all over the place. There really isn't a pattern to how these collagen fibers are packed together, right? And so if we're looking at where we could find these, regular dense connective tissue is fantastic to see in something like a ligament or a tendon, whereas irregular dense, we're looking at something like the dermis of the skin. All right, moving on to supportive connective tissues. This is going to be tissues that help protect our body and give us posture and structure and shape. So we're going to talk about two major forms, cartilage and bone, and we're going to talk about each of the categories in detail. So cartilage, all cartilages are going to have some things in common. They're going to have a semi-solid matrix, so like a gel-like matrix. They're chondrocytes, or chondro, we think cartilage, site, think cell. The chondrocytes are going to live in what's called a lacunae, which is like a little chamber. And then it's avascular, meaning we don't have blood vessels running through it. And so the cartilage can be difficult to heal if it gets injured because of that, because we don't have blood flow directly flowing to that cartilage. The bone has a solid matrix, and this is a calcium phosphate based matrix. I don't expect you to remember hydroxyapatite, but you should remember that is a calcium salt based matrix, and that's why you need calcium in your diet, or at least one of the reasons why you need calcium in your diet. The cells are called osteocytes, so osteo, we think bone, cyte, think cell, and they also live in chambers called lacunae. The big thing here, though, is that we do have blood vessels running through bone, so we're vascular. And so this is something that is helpful, like if you were to break a bone, you have blood flow in that area that can help heal that break relatively quickly compared to other parts that could be injured. So let's take a look at cartilage first. We have the cartoon drawing on the left, and we have the real deal on the right. So we're going to start at hyaline cartilage at the top. We see our gel matrix, right? It's very smooth looking, right? It looks almost like a fluid in a way, but it's not. It's a gel. You don't really see much of the fibers or anything running through it, at least not in the picture. And we have our cells living in these little chambers, right? So our chondrocytes live in the chambers. So that is hyaline cartilage. This is going to be found in places like in your nose, right? You're going to find these in the ends of your bones. That's where you'd find hyaline cartilage. Fibrocartilage. We are going to gain strength, but we're going to lose flexibility, because if we notice, we have a lot more of those collagen fibers running through. So with the extra collagen fibers, we gain strength, but we lose flexibility. We still have our chambers and our cells living in the chambers, and so we would find fibrocartilage in places like in between the vertebra in your back, right? That takes a beating, right? It's a hard place to work in the body, and so the fibrocartilage, we need that strength to be able to withstand all the weight, like our body weight that we have to hold upright all day, every day. Fibrocartilage gives us the strength to do that. Elastic cartilage is the most flexible of the cartilage, but it also means it's not going to be as supportive, so it's not going to be able to support your body weight the way like in between your vertebra, the fibrocartilage between the vertebra do. So we would find elastic cartilage like in your ears. So if you think about your ears, you can fold them around, you can move them, and it doesn't hurt, it doesn't bother you. And the cool thing about elastic cartilage is it can hold its shape even though it's flexible. So if you fold your ear in half and then you release it, it goes back to its normal original shape. And so this is because we have all these really thin elastin fibers in the matrix. So we see almost like, looks like little hairs going all over the place. And again, we still see our cells living in their chambers. Now bone tissue, I should say compact bone tissue is one that you're like, please quiz me on this one, because compact bone, which is what we see here on the left, is very distinct, very distinct, versus the spongy bone we see on the right, less distinct. It actually kind of looks like the adipose tissue a little bit to some degree. We see the marrow around it, but if we look at the bone itself, right, that's going to be these parts that are actually in that deeper pink, right? So there looks like there's some things that you might confuse with adipose tissue, but keep your eyes peeled for these little trabeculae of bone that contains that spongy bone right here. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to make that distinction. But let's look at the compact bone. So the compact bone, one, the color is already distinct. We get like a yellow-brown color, which is already very different color-wise compared to the rest. But the biggest thing is the pattern. We see a repeating circular pattern over and over and over again, very distinct of compact bone. Each of these major circles is called the osteon. So this is circular unit is an osteon. This would be a second osteon, a third, right, a fourth. So we see several osteons in this thing. That would be considered the functional unit of bone. Inside of the osteon, we have these concentric circles called lamellae. And these darker pieces, they almost look like little seeds. Those are the osteocytes living in their little chambers. Right, so they're pretty small. And then in the very middle, that dark circle, that is not a nucleus. Keep that in mind, this is not a nucleus. The cells are these itty bitties, right here. That middle dark circle is actually the central canal, and so what we find in the central canal is going to be things like blood vessels, nerves, right? That's going to contain major vessels and whatnot going through those osteons. That's why we say we have a direct blood flow. We're vascular because we have blood vessels that run right through these middle circles there. All right, and then we get our last category, which is the fluid connective tissue. The thing they have on common is that their matrix is a liquid, it is a fluid, and so their main thing is to transport things. And we have two main types, blood and lymph. So blood, again, is a nice one to be able to identify. It stands out pretty easily because we have all of these pink circles and then occasionally some bigger purple ones. The pink ones are erythrocytes, aka red blood cells. The purple ones are white blood cells. I know the colors don't make sense because it's a staining, but remember, we stain them because they're not very visible without the staining. And so this would be the fluid connective tissue. Everything around it, right, would be some sort of water-based matrix that would have things like solutes dissolved in it. We don't have a picture of lymph, but that's okay. I'm more worried about the blood. So now, how are we organized? How do we organize connective tissues together? So we're looking at fascia, or fascia, depending on who you talk to. But these undermembranes, right? Under these membranes, there's several different layers of connective tissues that are going to help connect the internal structures to the rest of the body. And so we have the superficial, the deep, and the subserous fascia. So let's look at how these are organized. So we have the skin, we have the superficial fascia. Superficial, we want to think closer to the surface, right? Closer to the outside. Then we have, like if we're looking at the muscle and bone, we have the deep fascia, right? Deep connective tissue. So we're looking at, like, if you think about like the, if you cut meat, right, that you're making, dinner with or something, you'll notice like deep fascia in that meat because you're looking at muscle. And the subserous fascia, we're looking at all the way down, like up against organs, right? Like here we have a gray box demonstrating a lung, right? So if we're looking at the order, superficial fascia is going to be the connective tissue that is closest to the surface. Deep fascia we're looking at in the fascia that's around muscle and bone, and then subserous we're looking at underneath, like a serous membrane, right, which is going to be up against an organ, like up against a gland,